What if I told you that the shortest war in recorded history lasted exactly 38 minutes and ended with one side suffering only a single injury while the other lost over 500 people? Imagine this: on August 27, 1896. The British Empire went to war against the Sultanate of Zanzibar over a succession dispute, and by 9:40 a.m. it was completely over. We're talking about a conflict so one-sided that British warships fired over 500 shells and 400 machine gun rounds while receiving absolutely no effective return fire. The Sultan's palace was destroyed, his navy was sunk, and his army was scattered all before most people had finished their breakfast. This wasn't just military superiority, it was such overwhelming technological dominance that it redefined what modern warfare could look like. If you think you understand the power of industrial military technology, this 38-minute war will show you just how devastating that advantage could be. So stay with me, because the details of this incredibly short conflict are absolutely mind-blowing. Welcome back to our historical investigations. Today we're exploring the Anglo-Zanzibar War of 1896, officially the shortest war in recorded history, lasting exactly 38 minutes and demonstrating the overwhelming technological superiority of industrial military power. In this video, we'll uncover how a succession dispute in an East African sultanate escalated into a devastating demonstration of British naval firepower, how modern military technology could completely overwhelm traditional defenses in minutes rather than months, and how this brief conflict established patterns of colonial domination that would define the scramble for Africa. We'll examine the incredible disparity in casualties and firepower that made this less a war than a military execution. Most remarkably, we'll see how the Anglo-Zanzibar War became a template for how imperial powers would use technological superiority to impose their will on traditional societies throughout the colonial era. The lessons learned from this 38-minute conflict influenced military strategy and colonial policy for decades to come. To understand how such a brief and one-sided conflict came about, we need to examine the complex political situation in Zanzibar and the broader context of European colonialism in East Africa during the 1890s. Zanzibar in 1896 was a strategically crucial island off the coast of East Africa, controlling important trade routes between the Indian Ocean, Arabia, and the African mainland. The Sultanate of Zanzibar had been a major center of the Indian Ocean slave trade and spice commerce for centuries, making it enormously wealthy and politically significant. The island was ruled by the Busaid dynasty, Arab sultans who had established their capital there in 1840 after moving from Oman. By the 1890s, however, Zanzibar's independence was largely theoretical. The British had been gradually extending their influence over the Sultanate through a series of treaties and agreements that gave them increasing control over Zanzibar's foreign policy and trade. The immediate cause of the war was a succession crisis. Sultan Hamad bin Thuwaini had ruled Zanzibar since 1893 under British protection, but he died suddenly on August 25, 1896. According to the treaties between Britain and Zanzibar, the succession required British approval, and the British preferred Hamad bin Mohammed, who was considered more compliant with British interests. However, Sultan Hamad's cousin, Khalid bin Bargash, had different ideas. Khalid was the nephew of the previous Sultan, Bargash bin Said, who had ruled from 1870 to 1888, and had initially resisted British influence before being forced to accept British protection. Khalid represented the traditional faction that wanted to restore genuine independence to Zanzibar. On August 25th, immediately after Sultan Hamad's death, Khalid moved quickly to seize power. He occupied the palace with about 800 supporters, including palace guards, servants, and volunteers from the local population. He also mobilized the Royal Zanzibar Navy, which consisted of one wooden warship, the HHS Glasgow, and several smaller boats. From Khalid's perspective, this was a legitimate claim to power. He was of royal blood, had significant local support, and was asserting Zanzibar's right to choose its own ruler without foreign interference. From the British perspective, this was rebellion against established treaty obligations that required their consent for any succession. The British response was swift and uncompromising. Basil Cave, the British consul in Zanzibar, immediately declared Khalid's assumption of power illegitimate and demanded that he vacate the palace. When Khalid refused, Cave requested naval support from the British Indian Ocean Squadron. This is where the overwhelming disparity in military capability becomes apparent. The British had 3 warships immediately available in Zanzibar's harbor: HMS Philomel, HMS Thrush, and HMS Raccoon. These were modern steel warships equipped with breech, floating cannons, machine guns, and explosive shells designed to devastate any target they engaged. The confrontation was set for August 27, 1896 at 9:00 a.m. The deadline Britain gave Khalid to surrender and leave the palace. This is where the Anglo-Zanzibar War reveals the devastating reality of technological superiority in late 19th century warfare. What happened on the morning of August 27th wasn't really a battle. It was a demonstration of how industrial military technology could completely overwhelm traditional defenses. At exactly 9:00 a.m., when Khalid failed to respond to the British ultimatum, Rear Admiral Harry Rawson gave the order to open fire. The British warships, positioned in Zanzibar harbor with clear lines of sight to the palace, began a systematic bombardment that would last exactly 38 minutes. The firepower disparity was almost incomprehensible. The British warships carried modern breech, loading cannons that could fire explosive shells with devastating accuracy. HMS Philomel and HMS Thrush each mounted 4-inch guns, while HMS Raccoon carried 6-inch naval guns. These weapons had been designed to engage armored warships and fortified coastal positions. Using them against a wooden palace was like using a sledgehammer to crack an egg. The palace, despite being the Sultan's official residence, had no meaningful military defenses against modern naval artillery. It was essentially a large wooden and stone building designed for administration and ceremony, not warfare. The palace walls that might have withstood traditional siege weapons were completely useless against explosive shells fired from naval guns. The battle began with the palace guards attempting to return fire with rifles and a few small cannons. But the range and accuracy of their weapons made effective retaliation impossible. British warships could fire from positions in the harbor that were completely beyond the range of anything the Sultan's forces possessed. The Sultan's navy was destroyed almost immediately. The HHS Glasgow, Zanzibar's only warship, was sunk within minutes of the bombardment beginning. The vessel, which had been built in the 1870s, was no match for modern naval gunfire and went down with most of its crew. Meanwhile, the palace itself was being systematically destroyed. British naval gunners, using techniques developed for coastal bombardment, methodically targeted different sections of the building. Explosive shells set fires throughout the structure while simultaneously destroying walls and killing defenders. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical destruction. The defenders had never experienced modern artillery bombardment, and the continuous explosions, fires, and collapse of buildings around them created panic that spread throughout their ranks. By 9:40 a.m., exactly 38 minutes after the bombardment began, the palace was in ruins. The Sultan's navy was at the bottom of the harbor, and Khalid bin Bargash had fled to seek asylum in the German consulate. The war was over before most residents of Zanzibar had realized it had begun. The casualty figures reveal the complete one-sidedness of the conflict. British forces suffered exactly one injury: a sailor who was wounded, not even killed. Zanzibar's losses were catastrophic. Approximately 500 killed and wounded, with most casualties occurring among the palace defenders who had no protection against naval artillery. But the deeper question is, why was this technological disparity so overwhelming, and what did it reveal about the nature of colonial warfare? Let's examine the different factors that made the Anglo-Zanzibar War possible and what it revealed about imperial military power in the late 19th century. Theory 1. Industrial Military Revolution. By 1896, the gap between industrial and pre-industrial military technology had become so vast that traditional military resistance was essentially impossible. The British warships represented decades of industrial development in metallurgy, explosives, and precision manufacturing that simply couldn't be matched by traditional weapons. The British naval guns could fire explosive shells with accuracy at ranges that made retaliation impossible. The steel construction of their warships made them essentially invulnerable to anything the Sultan's forces could deploy. This wasn't just superior weapons, it was a completely different category of military technology. Theory 2. Strategic psychological warfare. The British deliberately chose to use overwhelming force not just to win quickly, but to send a message to other potential resistors throughout their colonial empire. The 38-minute destruction of Zanzibar's government served as a demonstration of what would happen to anyone who challenged British authority. Contemporary British documents suggest that the speed and completeness of the victory was intended to discourage similar resistance movements in other parts of East Africa, where British influence was still being established. Theory 3. Colonial administrative efficiency. The Anglo-Zanzibar War represented the perfection of colonial control mechanisms. Rather than engaging in lengthy diplomatic negotiations or gradual pressure, the British had developed the capability to simply eliminate resistance through brief applications of overwhelming force. This model of rapid military intervention became a template for colonial administration throughout the British Empire, allowing small numbers of British officials to control vast territories through the threat of decisive military action. The evidence supporting these theories comes from multiple sources. British naval records document the systematic nature of the bombardment and the deliberate targeting of specific objectives to achieve maximum psychological impact with minimum expenditure of resources. Contemporary accounts by witnesses describe the complete shock and panic among Zanzibar's population, many of whom had never seen modern artillery in action. The psychological impact of the bombardment extended far beyond the immediate military targets. British Colonial Office documents reveal that the Zanzibar operation was studied and analyzed as a model for similar interventions in other parts of Africa. The techniques and timing used in the bombardment were incorporated into training manuals for colonial military operations. However, some historians argue that the Anglo-Zanzibar War was an exceptional case rather than a typical example of colonial warfare. They point out that most colonial conflicts involved much more extended resistance, and that technological superiority alone wasn't always sufficient to ensure quick victories. Critics also note that the war's brevity was partly due to Khalid's poor strategic planning and the unique geographic situation of Zanzibar as an island that could be easily isolated and bombarded from the sea. The immediate aftermath of the Anglo-Zanzibar War established patterns that would define British colonial administration in East Africa for decades. Khalid bin Bargash remained in German protection for several years before eventually being exiled to German East Africa, while the British installed their preferred candidate, Hamad bin Mohammed, as Sultan. More importantly, the war's outcome eliminated any possibility of meaningful resistance to British control in Zanzibar. The complete destruction of the Sultan's military forces and the demonstration of British firepower convinced local leaders that accommodation was the only viable option. The broader implications extended throughout East Africa. News of the 38-minute war spread rapidly among tribal leaders and local rulers, many of whom decided that cooperation with British colonial authorities was preferable to the alternative demonstrated in Zanzibar. The war also established legal and political precedents for British intervention in succession disputes throughout their sphere of influence. The principle that local rulers required British approval for legitimacy became accepted throughout British East Africa. For military history, the Anglo-Zanzibar War became a case study in the effectiveness of naval gunfire against land targets and the importance of technological superiority in colonial warfare. The tactics and techniques used were studied and refined for application in other colonial contexts. The question that emerges from studying this incredibly brief conflict is profound. What does it mean when military technology becomes so advanced that resistance becomes essentially impossible? And what are the implications when such overwhelming force can be applied in minutes rather than months, The Anglo-Zanzibar War represents a turning point in the nature of warfare and political power. It demonstrated that industrial military technology had created such vast disparities in capability that traditional concepts of military resistance were becoming obsolete. For colonized peoples throughout Africa and Asia, the lesson was clear. Direct military confrontation with industrial powers was suicidal. This realization forced the development of new forms of resistance, political, economic, and cultural, that could operate within the constraints imposed by overwhelming military disadvantage. The war also revealed how quickly political control could be established when backed by superior technology. The ability to destroy a government in 38 minutes fundamentally changed the dynamics of international relations and colonial administration. Do you think the Anglo-Zanzibar War represented inevitable progress in military technology, or was it an example of how industrial powers used technological advantages to dominate traditional societies? And what does this brief conflict reveal about the relationship between military capability and political legitimacy? Share your thoughts in the comments below. This brings us to the end of today's exploration of the shortest war in history. The Anglo-Zanzibar War demonstrates how technological disparities can create conflicts that are less battles than demonstrations of superior force. Understanding these historical examples helps us recognize how military technology continues to shape political relationships and international conflicts. If you found this story of 38-minute warfare fascinating, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe for more investigations into the most unusual and decisive conflicts in history. Ring the notification bell so you never miss our deep dives into the moments when technology and politics collided to change everything in minutes. Until next time, keep exploring the incredible ways that military innovation has shaped our world.